doing DeFi, greatest in the world, and they finally about to see why. What you know about XRD? I'm smart money, I ain't never on a decline. What you know about NFTs? It's not just Ace, when you finally gonna realize you need scalability, need more utility, then you better call on these guys. I'm going radical, I'm going Radix, I'm going radical, I'm going Radix. Hyperspeed DeFi, never on a decline, building the future.
Hello and welcome. I am Piers Ridyard, CEO of RDX Works, a core developer of the decentralized finance protocol Radix, a public ledger entirely focused on bringing DeFi into the mainstream. This is our podcast, the DeFi Download, a show about decentralized finance and all things crypto, where we dive into the details of the projects, assets, and services that are powering the DeFi revolution. Today, I have Ben and Amir, CTO and blossoming Scrypto developer at MLabs. MLabs is a Haskell, Rust, and blockchain AI consultancy. Ben, Amir, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us. Good to be here.
So, let's Haskell, Rust, blockchain and AI consultancy. There's a few things to unpack in there. It'd be great, Ben, to sort of understand how you guys came to be so many of the interesting things that are going on in the space all at the same time.
MLabs is always interested in slowly consuming the world. So we do kind of pick the most interesting areas that we can grow into. MLabs started off from fairly humble beginnings in really 2020, late 2019. We were a fairly small, 6-person consultancy working largely for fintech companies out in the world. One of the key contracts we were working with was JustPay at the time, which is a payment processor out of India. And infamously, one of the biggest companies that use Haskell in the traditional space. So kind of growing out of that, there's sort of naturally within the Haskell community, there's always a certain amount of overlap with Rust. I think the two languages do have sort of a lot of natural guiding principles in common. And we kind of had a right place, right time moment. I had some previous experience in blockchain, and we were actually presented with an opportunity to work on Liquid, which is Cardano's response to something like Compound. It's a lending market. So as we took that particular project on, which launched earlier this year, by the way, we sort of wound up doing a deep dive into building on Cardano and building Plutus smart contracts specifically. And we've sort of grown out from that, also building developer tools, performing audits. But we sort of specialized in Cardano DeFi in particular. We worked across all verticals, but we have either built or audited a pretty substantial percentage of the various protocols that make up Cardano's total value locked. Coming out of that, we also expanded into Polkadot, Solana, and a number of other ecosystems. Radix is sort of one of the more recent ones we've adopted.
Could you talk a little bit, just so that people understand? I think, Rust is relatively well known to people, but sort of Plutus and Haskell a little less so, apart from within the Cardano community itself. So just talk a little bit about Haskell and Plutus and your experiences of getting your team up to speed with that, and how that was as an experience.
Sure. So Haskell is certainly not a top 10 programming language. It's been around since the late 1980s. Perhaps as an explanation for why it has this natural motto, avoid success at all costs. But you might be you wouldn't be entirely mistaken if you mistook Haskell at times for maybe a really cool math exploration project, rather than necessarily a programming language per se.
Right.
There's some really brilliant libraries, but Haskell is a pure functional programming language, which means there's always caveats to this, but the general way to work within the language is you never perform an impure action. You return a context that will execute this impure action in the future. It tends to have a lot of fairly mathematically driven structures in how you operate with Haskell. However, between the nature of functional programming itself, where rather than hand coding structures over and over again like loops, you have sort of pre-built structures that allow you to compose bits of functionality together. Between that and the type system of Haskell, you do get a system that is wonderfully resilient against bugs. It can be used to create systems that are very, very bug resistant.
Right.
The natural boundaries there are at the seams. So things like, for those listeners who are maybe more technical, like parsing a JSON body out of a request, that tends to be where all the errors happen. Once something's brought in, any impossible states are made sort of unrepresentable within the type system if you want. So it does offer a lot of power in terms of long-term maintainability, and this is where it sees adoption in fintech at places like JustPay and Standard Chartered and Mercury Bank, as well as in the aerospace industry where you don't just lose money, but maybe kill someone if you've written incorrect code.
Right. So good for very like high criticality systems where you want to have incredibly robust guarantees around it, sort of behavior.
Yeah, absolutely. And that can come at the cost of speed, but it's actually also a fairly performant language. It's still many times faster than more popular languages like Python or JavaScript.
Sure.
This was adopted by Cardano as the language in which they would implement their node, and the first language where they would go ahead and implement the smart contract language, Plutus. So Plutus itself, you could say, is sort of a subset of Haskell. It doesn't have the full robustness of Haskell, but it does allow you to take advantage of some of that type system. So that Plutus itself launched in September of 2021, and we were working on things sort of well ahead of that launch date. Just like right now, we're working with Radix well ahead of the smart contract launch date.
Right.
At this point, although I'd say we're almost a little bit late to the party in that respect at this point.
Well, I mean, we launched the programming language in alpha a long time before integrating it with the network, which I don't think was quite the same path that Cardano took, right? That it was a much shorter time between release of the programming language and integration with Cardano's platform.
I think that's true now that we're looking at a September Babylon release. Yes.
Yeah. And from the point of view of Plutus, what are the things that you found so far Plutus to be good for, and what have you found to be more challenging when it comes to building programming applications?
So I think the biggest thing I can talk about with Plutus, and something I'll broaden a little bit to be the entire Cardano smart contract platform, and we can expand on that a bit. But one thing about it is tremendously secure. I mean, people are still getting audits done. Let's not get crazy, but I believe this is still the case, that funds lost on-chain due to a code exploitation is something remarkably low, if any. Certainly under 10K USD, to my knowledge. Exploits are almost entirely unheard of, and although it does take some more time to develop these smart contracts, and in some cases you may need to use an alternative language which compiles down to the same bytecode essentially that Plutus does. These are for efficiency gains so that you can get more logic onto your smart contract and eventually deploy. So we actually built one of these languages. I'd say right now there's 3 or 4 significant competitors. Some of this is just for people who don't want to write Haskell. So there's a few options, for a Rust or sort of Rust adjacent language. There's now options so that you can compose smart contracts from Python or TypeScript. And then there are just optimized versions of the Haskell way of writing them. So that's one of the projects that we've built for developer tooling to allow sort of advanced DeFi projects that need to cram every bit of efficiency they can in, so that they can actually ship. Right.
And is it also, because a lot of people, when they talk about Haskell, they talk about how secure it is. They also talk about how difficult it is to hire people, and how difficult it is to train people. Have you found that to be true as well, or has that not been the case for you guys?
So on this point, I mean, I would say finding Haskell people is sort of a thing that we specialize in.
Right.
So you may be asking the wrong person there, but there's also a tremendous shift. You see this with Rust as well. Rust and Haskell are languages that people like to write. There is at least a subset of developers who are very enthusiastic about Haskell, and in some cases will make a very substantial career change just for the opportunity to write production Haskell. And I think some of that is actually about the correctness that these languages can bring, and the result of that correctness is that it's more satisfying to write. And
I sometimes see people take almost a philosophical or principles-based approach when they are advocating for these kind of languages. You see a similar thing in the Rust community as well, where people love the language so much, love building with it so much, they're like, I will change my career so that I can build in Rust because I've fallen in love with Rust, and Rust is all I want to use.
It becomes ideological, certainly. So we don't find that there's necessarily a problem finding enthusiastic developers and talented ones. Now, the other grain of salt is certainly we are a worldwide distributed consultancy. You may not always be able to find this person in your backyard. Right. If you're looking for co-located or even in the same time zone, you may need to look a little broader. The other part is, naturally, there's deep communities, and the more involved in these communities that you become, the easier it is for you to recruit.
Right. So you guys started on the Haskell side, expanded out to Rust. How did that come about? It seems like they're quite close, sort of like from an ideological point of view. Obviously, the Rust community is bigger than the Haskell community. I'd say it's sort of less just a mathematical experiment and much more of a practical programming language as well. But how did that sort of when did that opportunity come across, and why did you guys decide to expand out to Rust?
It actually came out quite early, and if I'm honest, it's because I made a joke tweet about being a Haskeller, and someone approached us thinking they needed Haskell, but they needed Rust. And I think every Haskeller knows a few Rustaceans. We get along well enough. So we were able to bring some well-qualified people on, and from there we've had various operations in both Haskell and Rust over the past 3 years.
Okay. Yeah. And so obviously when you guys came across Scrypto, that the fact that Scrypto is based on Rust, I'm assuming, made it relatively easy to jump into. But before we talk about that and we sort of ask Amir about his experiences, could you just talk a little bit about how you discovered Radix and what that journey has been so far?
I think it's clear Radix has been running a bit of a promotional campaign over the last 8 months or so. So certainly we've seen tons of things on Twitter. My first real exposure to Radix organizationally was at Consensus 2023. So I'd heard a little bit going in. Certainly you guys had one of the biggest booths. You had an evening event as well. And what really impressed me was actually not just that you were present, which is very important, but also there was a sort of a thoughtfulness that I really appreciated about the approach, where it was really clear that there had been coordination with builders, that there were people there answering questions both on the trade show floor as well as at this pub night. Also, someone had managed to convince the bartender at the pub night to get a neck tattoo of the Aussie swap cat, stick and poke style. So that was like an interesting testament to at least, I don't know, enthusiasm. It was enough that I kind of walked away with some interesting impressions, some early introductions into the Radix community, and enough enthusiasm around what developers were experiencing on the ground from what I had heard, that we were willing to experiment further, and that essentially rolled into eventually us partnering with a couple of businesses that we already knew were interested in accessing other markets.
Yep.
And seeing if they would consider an experiment in Radix with us together. And fortunately, we were able to find some.
So clients that you're already working with who are already building in other communities like Cardano, then bringing across that functionality to the Radix network with your help. And how much of, and sort of how long has the run-up period been now? Like when did you guys get started sort of actually building in earnest on Radix?
So I'd say activity really started over the course of May and June, where we were starting to look at how we can, implement proofs of concept or look at architecting out, what a mainnet solution would look like for certain verticals. We also chose verticals that we felt were fairly conservative as far as a starting place.
Right. Just
sort of naturally, you want to go with the stuff with the lowest novelty budget. I don't think necessarily that I would start off by immediately going to something that might have technical blockers. Let's say ZK.
Right.
Like, I wouldn't necessarily start there in any ecosystem.
Yeah.
Part of that's because I have the luxury of working as a consultancy, so we're able to dip there's multiple projects to execute. It's not all or nothing on a single idea.
Yeah.
So it's been a way that we're able to sort of warm up to the technology, get multiple team members trained up and working in the space, and build up broader expertise that we could use
I think
for later
there's an
projects.
awful lot to be said for critical pieces of infrastructure that are known to be critical, have, as you say, low novelty value, but are well executed. I think often people under-index on how important and successful that can be as a strategy.
Yeah. Something like the Scrypto toolkit in particular, I'll call out as something that hey, this is a ready-to-go solution where you can build a truly decentralized app that doesn't necessarily require a lot of back-end infrastructure that is specific to your app in order to start interacting with the Radix network. That's really critical that it's available on day one. And in fact, we wound up building something similar for Cardano specifically to address sort of a dearth within the ecosystem.
Yeah. So Amir, if you've now been sort of getting up to speed on Scrypto, having sort of built several Haskell and Plutus applications before, I'd love to sort of hear a little bit about your experience in diving into Scrypto and how you found that experience since getting involved.
Yeah, so I would say that it's been quite interesting. I'd say the biggest difference for me has probably been when I started learning Plutus. It took me quite a while to even familiarize myself with the concepts and sort of the design patterns and sort of how Plutus works, and then working myself down to a bit lower level on the dealing with UTXOs and so on. For Scrypto, it seems like those have been really abstracted. The lower level fundamentals have sort of been abstracted away with these nice sort of concepts that, they're named really well and are really easy to grasp. So I'm not sure how much of that would be knowledge translating from my experience from Cardano coming into Scrypto, how much that translated into this learning process. But I feel like I could very easily read through the documentation that was available and very quickly understand and jump into some Scrypto community examples that are out there and really grasp what these smart contracts are doing and sort of play around with my own toy examples.
And what's been your sort of like your favorite thing about Scrypto so far, and and also just a little bit about what you've built so far, if you can talk about that. If you can't, then don't worry.
Yeah, so I've been mainly building some, I'd say, more example codes to sort of familiarize myself with Scrypto itself. I basically came into the community at a transition period between Scrypto v09 into v010. So I was just in that transition where there was these really nice changes to the authorization model and access roles. So at that point, it was just me. I was just getting familiarized with the previous models, but then we transitioned to the V10. So with regards to what I've been building, I've just been building simple examples. I've been playing around with some of the existing blueprints out there with pools and sort of accounts and so on, and some other toy examples that exist. The vesting example has been really helpful, and I tried to build some toy projects on top of that, and also a very tiny governance contract. Yeah,
I think it's okay to say like we're looking at building out DAO infrastructure really quickly. So sort of turnkey DAO management. And so there's a few ways that we're looking at approaching that with our partner over the course of the next couple of months. But we want to get some early proof of concepts that are going to see the most use from the communities that exist.
Right.
Because adoption's really key, and it helps drive the next thing, right? If you can't get engagement from the community that's there, you're not going to draw people in from other communities necessarily to use this thing.
Yeah, and I think another example of sort of lower novelty but critical tooling for an ecosystem. There are many innovations you can make in DAO tooling. I'm not saying that DAO tooling isn't innovative, can't be innovative, but it's one of those things that a lot of people don't go, I'm going to go build DAO tooling. But as soon as you try and build an application, you're like, oh, I need DAO tooling because I'm going to be building some form of governance into my DeFi application. Or
that's actually exactly why we have a DAO tooling partner in the first place, is we were building all these DeFi protocols and we just saw the waste of everybody needs to roll this from scratch.
Right.
And like really this needs to be a service that's available early, that's audited, and can save everybody their own audit funds by just reducing that surface area.
Yeah.
And really, I'd say that's sort of universal. We're trying to build, for these early ventures into Radix, we're trying to build tools primarily that are going to get picked up by other dApp developers as building blocks.
And so Amir, you've been building this governance functionality. As you've been building it, what are the things that you've sort of realized around Scrypto that you've sort of gone, this is interesting, this is helpful, I'm glad that this exists?
I'd say probably the number one thing that's been really helpful has been the concept of transaction manifest. It's just made my life so much easier to compose different transactions and sort of, make these calls and interactions without being within a very complicated language. It's been really easy to connect components and sort of move stuff around and experiment. So I guess that's really been one of the features where I've been like, well, this should exist for every ecosystem out there. And also, just generally the handling of assets seems to be very, very intuitive compared to what I've been used to. It's very simple to reason about them and move them around, whether they are NFTs or just general assets, and how they can be used for authorization has been, I'd say probably those two are the standout features for me.
Even just like the presenting mechanism within a transaction, like on other UTXO chains, this is a pattern that exists where you're gonna put something into a transaction and take it back out but you don't get the guarantees that come with this notion of presenting where it has to come back to you. You have to wire that in every time separately, right?
We when this was being designed, we talked about this as being guardrails, essentially guardrails for the programmer, guardrails for the user, where you can explicitly declare guarantees around what you expect to happen in a transaction, and you can also the other part of this is being able to specify your intent rather than specify the mechanism by which something has to be achieved, right? And so intent-based transactions are now, you're hearing people talking about this as a concept more also in Ethereum, because you now have things like L2s and sequences and things and abstracted accounts where you can have some form of intent-based transactions. But in Radix, every intent transaction is intent-based transaction. Every transaction you're specifically stating what you expect as an outcome, rather than having to go down to the state level and say, I want you to change this state for this state, which I struggle to explain to anyone as to why that's helpful or important until you have actually tried to build something yourself where you don't have those tools. And when you have, people are like, oh my God, this is amazing. But explaining that to someone who doesn't understand why these things are important or what the alternative is often difficult. Have you so Amir, you're currently building Scrypto. You've previously, and you like the authorization model and the transaction model. What's sort of like next for you? You're currently building the test versions. When do you start to expect to be pushing out sort of production code, and what can people expect when can people expect to start to be able to use this governance tooling?
So I guess we were aiming to have have this to push it into production sometime, maybe about a month after the Babylon release. But of course, much before that, I'm going to be running tests, internal tests, and so on the RCnet v2 that's live currently, and try to experiment and iron out some of the things that might still be new to me, or sort of bring myself up to speed.
Yeah. And Ben, from like just a strategic point of view, from building like having to work out how applications are built. We were talking a little bit before we started the podcast around how, from a high level, Scrypto helps with some of these conceptual helps in how you can build the architecture of applications. I'd love to sort of get a little bit more of an insight into how you think about that from a CTO point of view.
Sure. So some of my history in blockchain also comes from a history on Ethereum. So I've sort of lived both sides of sort of the EVM, fairly class-oriented, sort of object-oriented programming approach to smart contracts, as well as a couple of different platforms, either WASM-oriented, like we see on Solana, or like Cardano, and their own approach to smart contracts. And I'd say, like with Cardano, you have this notion of role-based scripts, which makes it very easy to validate like that a particular script is going to perform in a particular way, because it only can be used in particular ways. But what we like, this leads to a bit of a sort of difficulty just explaining things to people, because there's off-chain code relating to a smart contract, and then there's all these sort of independent pieces. So there isn't really a unit of code that you point to and say, like, that's the smart contract. This as like a starting point. So it's difficult to name things, and it's difficult to sort of grok sort of this piecemeal system. And I'd say one approach that I really appreciate Scrypto is that largely you do have that sort of unitary approach where you can sort of plug in different features to provide those roles. Moreover,
if you were gonna take that down, if you were gonna
Sure.
simplify what you just said
yeah.
to someone who's not a developer, how would you do that?
I'd say it's the difference between specifying all the pieces of a robot and instead just saying like this robot needs to achieve certain outcomes, right? It needs to be able to handle assets. So we should give it a vault, right? As opposed to sort of building up all those individual pieces and assembling them amorphously. It gives you a bit more of a framework to work in that can reduce the sort of load. I guess cognitive load would be the developer term for it, but I guess to break that down, it's like the difference between having IKEA instructions that let you know sort of how things should go together, and you can sort of, if you want, make something Frankenstein if you need to, but you have good rails to stick to. The other part would be like this would be as opposed to just like building furniture from a pile of individual pieces, right? You absolutely can do it. It might take you more time. And I think that's really what we're talking about, is the speed of development and even more so than the language design itself, just the underpinning software has a very good quick route to get a feedback loop on what you're doing. These two pieces together just dramatically speed up development. Even over EVM solutions, I would say.
Yeah. And how about on the security side? Because obviously, classically, one often associates the speed at which you can stand something up to be inversely proportional to how secure it's going to end up being.
I mean, I think we're still very early days as far as crypto security research.
Yep.
But it at least feels like certain kinds of easy attack vectors may be much harder. Like, you're sort of baking those into the intentions, right? So you mentioned this sort of intention-based design. If you're just stating your intentions and sort of Scrypto is figuring the rest out for you to some extent, then it's less likely that you'll forget an important check, I would say. Or at least if we find something that's not being checked, we can fix Scrypto, and even necessarily without a code change, just a Scrypto version bump.
Right.
It's fixed for everybody, right?
Right. So you're abstracting away some of the things that you have to hand roll yourself on every transaction, but you're relying more on things like the inherent functionality of the programming language, or indeed the Radix engine that sits underneath that. Okay. Really cool. So like if you were having, recently got into relatively recently got into Radix and Scrypto, what recommendations would you give to other sort of aspiring Scrypto developers who've maybe not yet made the plunge, or people who are building in other ecosystems and thinking about coming across to Radix? What are the main sort of like tips, tricks, and recommendations you have for that?
Do you want to lead this one, Amir?
Yeah.
Or I will.
Yeah,
go
so I'm just muted. So I would say I think it's very easy to sort of procrastinate and sort of find the fact that, it's built in Rust and this low-level systems language, and it might be daunting, but that's definitely not been the case for me. I think even if you don't have a very strong or much knowledge at all about Rust, Scrypto is definitely something that you can pick up. It's quite the APIs are quite straightforward. They're named well, and the documentation is provided online are definitely helpful to bring yourself up to speed. I'd say the Discord and the community are very, very active and super responsive. I've found that extremely helpful. I'd say that's something that any new blossoming Scrypto developer should definitely get on board with. And I would say, I'd probably say to start as soon as possible to start playing around, looking at examples, getting to examples working, running things on the emulator and sort of getting a feel for how things work and sort of how not that it's not this sort of big beast, and it can definitely be easily. It's something that can easily be picked up, in my opinion.
The hackathon repos were really, really helpful. I will say, like that's if you're looking for just examples of what it might look like to have like a toy AMM or a toy version of a particular implementation.
Right. Yeah, I'd just say that some of those might be slightly outdated because of the new bump to Scrypto v10, but they will still definitely very helpful in terms of just looking at examples.
Yeah, outdated in terms of the version of the Scrypto, but from the point of view of just being able to look at something and going, oh, approximately how would I implement this? Like, what do I need to understand from how you architect something? What do I need to understand from about approximately how the language works? I think, I've heard that a lot for sure. That the open source repos are helpful. The example hackathon repos where I think we've got like over 100 examples of implementations of AMMs, of lending markets, of DeFi, of derivatives, of oracles, all sorts of things for sure.
And, like, one thing I'll say is there's like a fairly Ubuntu specific layer of support, but that means there's one way to get there and that everybody's on the same page. Be prepared to install Ubuntu or a VM, but other than that, like the docs are really accurate overall compared to multiple other ecosystems that we've worked in. They're almost always pretty close to right up to date, and like the affected portions when there is something that's out of date tends to be reasonably small. This is something we really appreciate. Like to me, it's more about like your typical maybe full stack JavaScript developer who is used to the sort of docs quality that they get on MDN and has maybe not had that experience in crypto, because I don't think anybody can rival MDN's completeness, so to speak. But we find sort of one of the most reliable docs experiences with Radix.
That's great to hear. Like our starting point was we want to have the best docs in crypto, and then our next point is like we want to have parity to Web 2, like good Web 2 standards. We know we're not yet at like good Web 2 standards, but we know that we're head and shoulders above most crypto docs, and it's something, and that makes me very proud to hear. Thank you for saying that, because it was one of these things that we were like, it's not sexy and it's not going to get you, it's not something that like lots of people are going to shout about, but it is something that just makes a huge difference at quality of life experience when you're trying to build something real using the platform.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more.
Awesome. Well, it's been great having you on the show. Thank you very much, Ben. Thank you very much, Amir. And, sort of very, very grateful to have you guys in the Radix ecosystem and building what you guys are, and really looking forward to more stuff coming out of MLabs and the clients that you are sort of bringing to the Radix ecosystem as well.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, good to be here. Thanks for having us, Piers.
More utility, then you better call on these guys. I'm going radical, I'm going Radix, I'm going radical, I'm going Radix. Hyperspeed DeFi, never on a decline. Building the future, I feel like a savage.